My name is Sarah Martinez, and 6 days ago I watched my family circle around my father's casket like vultures eyeing roadkill. They weren't mourning David Martinez, the man who taught me how to change a tire and always saved the last piece of pie for whoever had the worst day. They were calculating, whispering about property values and bank accounts while his body was still warm. My brother Kevin actually pulled out his phone during the eulogy to check real estate listings. That should have been my first clue that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to shatter like cheap glass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what really gets me. As we stood there in Westfield Memorial Chapel, surrounded by the scent of lilies and the weight of grief, my Uncle Bob leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart, we'll make sure you get something, even if it's just scraps." He said it with this patronizing smile, like he was doing me some grand favor, like I was the charity case of the family who needed their pity. What none of them knew, what I was about to discover in the most shocking way possible, was that my father had been playing a game none of us even knew existed. And I wasn't getting the scraps. I was getting the whole damn empire. The morning of Dad's funeral started like any other terrible day. I woke up in my cramped apartment on Pacific Vista Drive, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. The black dress I'd bought for the occasion hung on my closet door like a judge's robe, waiting to sentence me to a day of fake sympathy and family politics. I'd been dreading this moment for 3 months, ever since Dad collapsed at the hardware store while picking out screws for what he called another little project. The doctors said his heart simply gave out. 67 years of fixing everything for everyone else, and the one thing he couldn't repair was himself. I drove to the chapel in Dad's old truck, the 2008 Ford F-150 that Kevin had already started calling that piece of junk. The engine made a sound like a coffee grinder having an argument with itself, but it ran. Dad always said reliability mattered more than appearances, which pretty much summed up his entire philosophy on life. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see my siblings had already arrived. Kevin's shiny BMW sat next to Lisa's white Lexus SUV, both vehicles worth more than I made in 6 months as a school librarian. Even in death, Dad was being upstaged by his own children's success. The chapel was fuller than I'd expected. Mrs. Vasquez from next door sat in the third row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Dad's old crew from the maintenance department had shown up in their best shirts and uncomfortable ties. There were people I didn't recognize, faces that looked familiar but couldn't quite place. What struck me most was how they all seemed to genuinely miss him. These weren't people calculating inheritance shares or wondering about property values. They were mourning David Martinez, the man who fixed their leaky faucets and never charged full price. Kevin stood near the front, already in what I'd come to recognize as his executive mode. At 38, my older brother had perfected the art of looking important while doing very little. His corporate sales job had given him a vocabulary full of synergy and optimization but couldn't teach him basic human decency. He was talking to Uncle Bob in hushed tones, gesturing toward papers that looked suspiciously like legal documents. Even before the service had started, they were dividing up Dad's life like it was a corporate merger. Lisa arrived with her husband Mark and their 2 kids, Emma and Jake. She moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who sold houses for a living, shaking hands and accepting condolences like she was working a networking event. My sister had always been good at reading people, at knowing exactly what they wanted to hear. It made her excellent at real estate and terrible at genuine human connection. She caught my eye across the room and gave me one of her professional smiles, the kind she probably used on difficult clients. The service itself was a blur of platitudes and half-remembered stories. The pastor, who'd met Dad exactly once, delivered a generic eulogy that could have applied to any hard-working father. Kevin spoke about Dad's simple values and modest dreams, his voice carrying just the right amount of emotion for the audience. Lisa talked about family legacy and how Dad would want us to support each other through these difficult times. When it was my turn to speak, I told them about the Saturday mornings when Dad would take me to job sites, teaching me the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. I talked about how he could fix anything with duct tape and determination, and how he always said the most important tool in any toolbox was patience. What I didn't say was how Dad had changed in his final months. How he'd started talking about surprises and things not being what they seemed. How he'd become almost secretive about his daily routines, disappearing for hours at a time and returning with dirt under his fingernails and a satisfied expression. I'd assumed it was grief over Mom's death finally catching up with him, or maybe just the eccentricity that comes with age. Now sitting in that chapel listening to my family reduce his life to talking points, I wished I'd paid more attention. After the service, we gathered at the Denny's on University Avenue for what Uncle Bob called the Practical Matters discussion. The restaurant was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, just us and a few truckers nursing coffee at the counter. We squeezed into a corner booth, the kind of place where families have fought over wills for generations. Uncle Bob had appointed himself the unofficial executor, despite Dad never actually giving him that authority. He spread papers across the sticky table like he was dealing cards. Now Bob began, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd watched too many legal dramas. David wasn't what you'd call a wealthy man, but he was responsible. He left things neat and tidy. He pulled out a handwritten list that looked like Dad's careful printing. The house goes to Kevin since he's the oldest son and has the most stable income. Lisa gets the savings account and the life insurance payout. Sarah, he paused here and I could see the pity gathering in his eyes like storm clouds. Sarah gets the truck, his tools, personal belongings, and that storage unit he was always messing around with. Kevin immediately started nodding, already calculating property values in his head. The house on Maple Street wasn't much to look at, but it sat on a decent-sized lot in an area that was slowly gentrifying. Lisa seemed pleased with the financial.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Accounts, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of appropriate grief. And me? I got the scraps, the leftovers, the things nobody else wanted. That storage unit probably has more junk than a hoarder's garage, Kevin said with a laugh that had sharp edges. Dad was always collecting broken appliances and car parts. You'll probably need to pay to have it all hauled away. Lisa patted my hand with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for sick pets. At least you got something, sweetie. And the truck runs, which is more than anyone expected. Uncle Bob leaned back in the booth, clearly pleased with his distribution of justice. I think David would be happy knowing his children are taken care of according to their needs and abilities, he said, as if Dad had personally consulted with him from beyond the grave. Kevin can handle the responsibility of property ownership. Lisa understands financial management, and Sarah can keep the sentimental items that matter most. The condescension was so thick I could have cut it with one of Dad's rusty screwdrivers. They were talking about me like I was some kind of beloved family pet who needed special consideration. Poor Sarah, who'd never married successfully, who worked with books instead of people, who drove a car held together with prayer and automotive tape. Poor Sarah, who'd spent every weekend for the past 5 years visiting Dad while they were too busy with their important lives to call. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and tell them exactly what I thought of their generous distribution of according to needs and abilities. Instead, I nodded and thanked them for being so thoughtful. Because that's what I'd always done in this family. I was the peacekeeper, the one who swallowed her anger to keep everyone comfortable, the one who got the scraps and smiled about it. That night, I sat in Dad's kitchen, surrounded by the boxes Kevin had so graciously given me 2 days to pack. The house felt enormous and empty without Dad's presence filling it. I'd found myself looking for him around every corner, expecting to see him tinkering with some small appliance or reading the newspaper in his favorite chair. Instead, there were just shadows and the smell of Old Spice aftershave that seemed to linger in the walls themselves. I'd started with his bedroom, carefully folding clothes that still carried his scent and packing away the books he'd read and reread until the covers fell apart. In his nightstand drawer, I found the usual collection of reading glasses, medications, and pocket change. But there was also something unexpected, a business card for Margaret Chen, attorney at law, with a handwritten note on the back that said for Sarah when the time comes. The card was worn soft around the edges, like Dad had been carrying it for months. The discovery of that business card should have felt significant, but I was too emotionally drained to process what it might mean. I slipped it into my pocket and continued packing, working my way through a lifetime of accumulated possessions. Dad's tool collection alone filled 3 large boxes. These weren't the cheap tools you'd find at a discount store, but professional-grade equipment that had been carefully maintained and organized. Each wrench had its place, each screwdriver was clean and sharp. Even his measuring tape was the expensive kind that carpenters used on serious projects. Kevin stopped by around 9 o'clock, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really to make sure I wasn't taking anything valuable. He walked through the house like he was conducting an inspection, opening drawers and closets with the casual authority of new ownership. "You know," he said, running his hand along the kitchen counter, "this place has good bones. Needs updating, obviously, but the lot size alone makes it worth renovating." I watched him mentally redesigning Dad's home, erasing every trace of the man who'd lived there for 35 years. "Are you going to live here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Kevin's house in the hills had granite countertops and a 3-car garage. He wasn't moving backward into a 1960s ranch with popcorn ceilings and original hardwood floors. "God, no," he laughed. "I'll probably flip it. Maybe turn it into a rental property. The neighborhood's changing, lots of young families moving in. Could be a good investment." He said it so casually, like Dad's home was just another commodity to be optimized for profit. Like the vegetable garden Dad had tended for decades was just wasted space that could be converted into parking. After Kevin left, I found myself standing in Dad's garage, surrounded by workbenches and pegboards full of tools arranged with military precision. This had been his sanctuary, the place where broken things came to be made whole again. I could picture him here on weekend mornings, coffee mug within reach, tackling whatever project had captured his attention. The garage told the story of a man who understood how things worked, who believed everything could be fixed with enough patience and the right approach. That's when I noticed something odd. The workbench was clean, almost suspiciously so. Dad had always been organized, but this level of tidiness suggested preparation, like he'd been getting ready for something. I started opening drawers systematically, looking for anything that might explain his recent secretiveness. Most contained the expected collection of screws, nails, and miscellaneous hardware. But the bottom drawer of his main workbench was locked. I spent 20 minutes searching for the key before finding it taped under the workbench's edge. Inside the drawer was a manila folder containing what looked like rental agreements, property tax receipts, and bank statements. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Monthly deposits of thousands of dollars, property addresses I didn't recognize, and references to something called Martinez Holdings LLC. I stared at the papers until my eyes watered, trying to understand what I was looking at. The rental agreements were the most confusing part. They showed properties all over Riverside and San Bernardino counties, addresses like 4847 Grove Street and 1623 Pine Avenue, with monthly rents ranging from $1,200 to $1,800. Each agreement was signed by David Martinez as landlord, and each showed consistent monthly payments going back years. According to these documents, my father wasn't just a maintenance supervisor living paycheck to paycheck. He was collecting rent from a dozen different properties. I sat on the garage floor until well past midnight, spreading papers around me like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle I couldn't quite solve. There were receipts for property purchases, invoices for renovation work, and bank statements showing balances that made my head spin. My father, the man who drove a 15-year-old truck and bought his clothes at Walmart, apparently had investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The most shocking discovery was a letter addressed to me, dated just 2 weeks before Dad's death. The envelope had my name written in his careful handwriting, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that changed everything. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and it's time for you to know the truth. I spent 25 years building something for you, something the others would never understand or appreciate. Margaret Chen has all the details. Don't let them convince you that you got the scraps. You got the kingdom. Love, Dad." I read the letter 3 times before the words began to make sense. The storage unit Kevin had mocked, the one Uncle Bob had dismissed as filled with junk, wasn't full of broken appliances and car parts. It was full of documents, records, evidence of an empire my father had built in secret, one property at a time, one renovation at a time. And he'd left it all to me. The next morning, I called Margaret Chen's office before I'd even had coffee. Her secretary scheduled me for that afternoon, and I spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous anticipation that made it impossible to focus on anything else. I kept pulling out Dad's letter and rereading it, looking for clues I might have missed. The phrase "they would never understand or appreciate" stuck with me. Had Dad known how his other children would react? Had he seen their greed and condescension coming from a mile away? Margaret Chen's office was on the third floor of a modest building downtown, the kind of place that housed accountants and insurance agents rather than high-powered attorneys. But when I met Margaret herself, I could tell immediately that appearances were deceiving. She was sharp, professional, and had the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of family drama the legal system had to offer. "Your father was one of my most interesting clients," she said, settling behind her desk with a thick file marked Martinez, David Estate Planning. "He came to me about 8 years ago with a very specific vision. He wanted to build wealth that would last, but he wanted to do it quietly. He was particularly concerned about protecting his assets from what he called family interference." She opened the file and pulled out a document that looked official and intimidating. "Mr. Martinez established a limited liability company called Martinez Holdings, with you as the sole beneficiary upon his death. The company owns 12 rental properties, 1 commercial building, 4 undeveloped lots, and maintains several investment accounts. The total estimated value of the estate is approximately $2.3 million. I stared at her like she'd just told me I was secretly related to royalty. $2.3 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like she was talking about the national debt or the distance to Mars. "That can't be right," I said, my voice coming out smaller than intended. "My dad worked maintenance. He lived in a tiny house and drove an old truck." Margaret smiled, and I could see she'd had this conversation before. "Your father was exceptionally good at what we call stealth wealth. He lived modestly while systematically acquiring undervalued properties, renovating them himself, and renting them out. Every dollar of profit went back into buying more properties. He was, quite frankly, a real estate genius who disguised himself as a simple working man." She pulled out a map with colored pins showing the location of each property. They were scattered across 2 counties, but I could see the strategy now. Dad had focused on working-class neighborhoods that were just beginning to improve, buying houses that needed work, and turning them into solid rental income. The commercial building housed a restaurant, a barber shop, and a tax preparation service. The undeveloped lots were in areas zoned for residential development. The monthly rental income alone is approximately $18,000. Margaret continued. "Your father's business model was remarkably sustainable. He kept rents reasonable to maintain good tenants, handled all maintenance himself to minimize expenses, and reinvested profits into expansion. It's the kind of portfolio that most real estate investors dream of building." As she spoke, I began to understand Dad's recent behavior with perfect clarity. The mysterious disappearances weren't signs of grief or eccentricity. He'd been managing properties, collecting rent, handling maintenance requests. The dirt under his fingernails hadn't come from hobby gardening but from real work on real investments. All those little projects he'd mentioned weren't weekend tinkering but serious property improvements that added value and commanded higher rents. "What about the storage unit?" I asked, remembering Kevin's dismissive comments about junk and broken appliances. Margaret's smile widened.
Yes, the storage unit.
"Your father had quite a sense of humor about that. It contains all the property documentation, rental agreements, maintenance records, and approximately $45,000 in cash reserves for emergency repairs and property improvements. He told me once that if his other children knew what was really in there, they'd probably try to break in with crowbars." The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. Kevin, who'd spent the funeral calculating property values and making jokes about my junk inheritance, had literally handed me the keys to an empire. Lisa, who sold real estate for a living, had completely missed the fact that her father was one of the most successful property investors in the county. Uncle Bob, who distributed Dad's assets according to needs and abilities, had given the person he considered least capable the most valuable inheritance. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out another document. "Your father left specific instructions about how this information should be revealed to the family. He wanted you to have time to understand the full scope of what you've inherited before anyone else found out. He was quite concerned about what he called sudden family interest in your well-being." She handed me a sealed envelope with "For Sarah open in 1 week" written on the front. "These are his instructions for handling what he anticipated would be some very surprised relatives." He was, as I mentioned, quite thorough in his planning. I left Margaret's office feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's life. The woman who'd walked in was Sarah Martinez, the family charity case who got the scraps and was grateful for them. The woman walking out was Sarah Martinez, accidental real estate mogul, an inheritor of a multi-million-dollar empire, built with hammers and determination. The transformation felt surreal, like discovering you've been playing chess while everyone else thought it was checkers. That evening, I drove to the storage unit on Industrial Boulevard, the one Kevin had predicted would cost me money to clean out. The facility was the kind of place where people stored Christmas decorations and old furniture, row after row of identical metal doors secured with padlocks. Unit 247 looked exactly like all the others, giving no hint of the treasure it contained. When I rolled up the metal door, I found myself looking at Dad's final masterpiece of organization. The unit was lined with filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with addresses and years. There were boxes of receipts, folders of photographs showing before and after shots of renovations, and detailed maintenance logs for every property. In the center of the unit, a desk held a computer and printer, along with a coffee maker and a small refrigerator. This wasn't storage. This was an office. I spent 3 hours that night reading through files, understanding for the first time the scope of what Dad had built. Each property had its own folder containing purchase documents, renovation photos, tenant histories, and profit calculations. The attention to detail was staggering. He'd tracked every expense, every improvement, every dollar of income with the precision of a professional accountant. But more than that, I could see the care he'd put into each property. These weren't just investments to him. They were homes he'd restored, neighborhoods he'd helped improve, tenants he'd treated fairly and respectfully. The cash reserves Margaret had mentioned were in a fireproof safe bolted to the concrete floor. $45,000 in neat bundles, along with spare keys to every property, and a handwritten note that read, "Emergency fund for when tenants need help, or properties need immediate attention. Never let a good tenant go homeless over temporary financial problems." Dad, even in death, he was still teaching me about the kind of landlord he'd been. As I drove home that night, I passed several of the properties I now owned without even realizing it. The duplex on Grove Street where I'd bought gas for years. The small apartment building on Pine Avenue, where I'd once considered renting. The commercial building downtown where I'd eaten lunch dozens of times. Dad had been hiding in plain sight, building an empire one property at a time, while his family remained completely oblivious. The next morning brought the first challenge to my newfound knowledge. Kevin called at 7:30, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone about to ask for a favor. "Hey Sarah, I've been thinking about Dad's storage unit. You know there might be some family photos in there, maybe some of Mom's old things. Would you mind if I came by to take a look? Maybe help you sort through everything?" I could hear the real question underneath his words. Kevin had been calculating, probably researching storage unit auctions, and wondering if Dad had hidden anything valuable among the junk. The idea that his little sister might have gotten something worth having was slowly occurring to him, and he wanted to investigate before it was too late to renegotiate the inheritance distribution. "Actually," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, "I'm still working through everything. It's going to take some time to sort out what's worth keeping. I'll let you know if I find anything that belongs to the family." The phrase "belongs to the family" tasted strange in my mouth. For the first time in my life, I had something that was entirely mine, something nobody could claim, or redistribute or dismiss as scraps. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about Dad's letter. Don't let them convince you that you got the scraps. You got the kingdom. He'd known exactly what would happen at that Denny's booth. He'd predicted their condescension, their casual dismissal of my inheritance, their complete inability to see value in anything that didn't immediately announce its worth. And he'd set it up perfectly, giving them exactly what they expected while ensuring I got exactly what I deserved. The sealed envelope Margaret had given me sat on my counter like a ticking time bomb. Part of me wanted to rip it open immediately, to read Dad's instructions for handling what was sure to be a complicated family situation. But another part of me wanted to savor this moment of secret knowledge. This brief time when I alone understood the truth about what Dad had built and what he'd left behind. Tomorrow everything would change. Today I could still be the underestimated daughter who'd gotten the scraps, and was grateful for them. I spent the day visiting my properties, though I still couldn't quite think of them that way. Each location revealed something new about the man I'd thought I knew completely. The duplex on Grove Street had a beautiful garden that Dad had obviously maintained himself, with vegetables growing in neat rows and fruit trees heavy with oranges. The apartment building on Pine Avenue was occupied by families who kept the place immaculate, suggesting Dad had been the kind of landlord who attracted responsible tenants by treating them with respect. At each property, I found evidence of Dad's hands-on approach. Fresh paint where it was needed, well-maintained landscaping, small improvements that made the difference between a house and a home. He hadn't been a slumlord extracting maximum profit from minimum investment. He'd been a craftsman, building something sustainable and beautiful, and meant to last. The fact that it was also incredibly profitable seemed almost secondary to the pride he'd taken in doing the work right. That evening, I finally opened Dad's letter to read his instructions for revealing the truth to my family. His strategy was characteristically methodical and surprisingly sophisticated. He wanted me to wait until Kevin and Lisa had fully committed to their plans for their inheritances, until they'd made their condescending comments and patronizing offers of help. Only then was I supposed to schedule a family meeting and reveal the existence of Martinez Holdings LLC. They need to understand, he'd written, that their assumptions about value and worth are what cost them their inheritance. Kevin will want to negotiate. Lisa will claim she could have managed the properties better. Bob will insist the whole thing is suspicious and demand an investigation. Don't let them rewrite history. You got the kingdom because you were the only one who saw past appearances to understand what really mattered. His final instruction was the most telling. Don't feel guilty about their reactions. I spent 25 years building this for someone who would appreciate it, not someone who would exploit it. You're the daughter who visited every weekend, who listened to my stories, who understood that fixing things is about more than just making them work. The other saw a maintenance man living in a small house. You saw a father who never met a problem he couldn't solve. As I sat there reading his words, I realized that Dad's greatest creation wasn't the real estate empire, or the investment accounts, or even the sustainable business model he'd built from scratch. His greatest creation was this moment, this perfect reversal of expectations that would force my family to confront their own assumptions about success and value, and who deserved what. Tomorrow, the girl who got the scraps would become the woman who got everything, and they would have to live with the knowledge that their own prejudices had cost them millions. The week following Dad's instructions felt like living in two different realities simultaneously. In one
reality, I was still Sarah Martinez, the librarian who drove an old truck and lived paycheck to paycheck, graciously accepting the family's leftover inheritance. In the other reality, I was the secret owner of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, walking through properties that generated more monthly income than most people made in a year. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but also oddly empowering. For the first time in my adult life, I knew something my family didn't. Kevin called 3 more times that week, each conversation a masterclass in transparent manipulation. On Tuesday, he wanted to help me organize Dad's tools because surely I couldn't understand their value or proper storage. On Thursday, he offered to take the truck to his mechanic for a complete inspection since I probably didn't know how to evaluate its mechanical condition. By Saturday, he was suggesting we hire professional estate sale organizers to handle Dad's belongings, split 3 ways of course, because these things can be overwhelming for someone without business experience. Each conversation made Dad's letter feel more prophetic. Kevin wasn't offering help out of brotherly concern. He was fishing, sensing that something didn't add up about the inheritance distribution, but unable to pinpoint exactly what. His corporate instincts were telling him there was value somewhere, but his assumptions about Dad's modest lifestyle kept him from imagining the truth. The irony was delicious. The brother who'd spent years lecturing me about financial responsibility and investment strategies was completely blind to the most successful real estate operation in the county. Lisa's approach was subtler but equally predictable. She stopped by my apartment Thursday evening with takeout Chinese food and what she called sisterly concern. We sat at my tiny kitchen table, surrounded by the kind of cramped, modest furnishings that reinforced her perception of my circumstances. She picked at her Lomian while delivering a carefully rehearsed speech about moving forward and not getting stuck in the past. "You know, Sarah," she said, her real estate agent voice sliding into the conversation like oil on water, "I've been thinking about your situation. Living in this apartment, working at the library, now dealing with Dad's truck and all those old tools. It's a lot for anyone to handle." She paused to sip her tea, letting the implications settle. "I could help you sell everything properly. Make sure you get fair market value instead of getting taken advantage of by some predatory buyer." The condescension was so thick I could have served it with a spoon. Lisa was positioning herself as my financial savior, the successful sister swooping in to rescue poor Sarah from her own incompetence. What made it even more galling was that she genuinely seemed to believe she was being generous. In her mind, offering to manage my small inheritance was an act of family charity, not the transparent attempt at control it actually was. I appreciate the offer, I said, practicing the diplomatic tone I'd been perfecting all week, but I'm not ready to make any major decisions yet. I need time to process everything. It was true enough, though not in the way she understood. I needed time to figure out how to reveal the truth without completely destroying what was left of our family relationships. Uncle Bob proved to be the most persistent of all. He'd apparently appointed himself as Dad's unofficial biographer, stopping by the house on Maple Street every day to help with the transition and share memories of their childhood together. What he was really doing was conducting an inventory, noting every stick of furniture and appliance with the thoroughness of an insurance adjuster. He'd clearly decided that Kevin's inheritance was more valuable than initially assessed, and he wanted to make sure nothing valuable disappeared before the official property transfer. "Your father was always secretive about money," Bob told me Friday afternoon as we stood in Dad's garage. He was examining the tool collection with obvious envy, running his hands over the expensive equipment like he was appraising jewelry. Even as kids, David never talked about what he had or what he wanted. Made it hard to help him sometimes. I watched him hefting a professional-grade circular saw, one of dozens of tools that were worth more individually than most people realized. Help him with what? I asked, genuinely curious about this version of Dad's history I'd never heard before. Bob's expression shifted, revealing something calculating underneath his grandfatherly concern. Financial planning. Investment opportunities. David had steady work, but he never seemed interested in building real wealth. Always said he was content with simple living. He set down the saw and fixed me with what I'd come to recognize as his teaching moment look. "That's why it's so important for you kids to be smart about what he left behind. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment about practical value." The statement was so perfectly wrong it took actual effort not to laugh. Dad had been building real wealth for 25 years while Uncle Bob was selling used cars and giving unsolicited financial advice. The simple living Bob mistook for lack of ambition had been the camouflage that allowed Dad to accumulate millions without attracting attention or interference. Every modest choice, every old truck, every home-cooked meal had been a conscious decision to live below his means, while his investments compounded in secret. By Sunday, the pressure from my family had reached a crescendo. Kevin showed up at my apartment with Lisa in tow, both of them wearing expressions of staged concern that didn't quite hide their underlying frustration. They'd clearly coordinated this intervention, probably over breakfast at some upscale restaurant where they'd discussed the Sarah situation like I was a problem requiring management. "We need to talk," Kevin announced, settling onto my couch with the authority of someone accustomed to running meetings. Lisa arranged herself in the chair across from him, pulling out her phone to take notes like this was a business consultation. The whole performance was so perfectly them that I almost felt nostalgic for the days when their condescension was merely annoying instead of actively insulting. "We're worried about you," Lisa began, her voice carrying the kind of professional sympathy she probably used with clients going through divorce proceedings. "You've been isolating yourself, spending all your time with Dad's old things instead of processing your grief. It's not healthy, and we think you might be avoiding some difficult but necessary decisions." Kevin leaned forward, entering what I recognized as his sales mode. "Look, Sarah, we know this is hard. Losing Dad, dealing with the inheritance logistics, trying to figure out what to do with a bunch of old tools and a storage unit full of junk. But you can't just hide from reality forever. There are practical considerations that need attention." They'd rehearsed this conversation, probably multiple times. Every phrase was designed to position them as the responsible adults helping their overwhelmed little sister face facts she was too emotional to handle alone. The subtext was clear. I was incapable of managing even a modest inheritance without guidance, and they were generously offering to take that burden off my shoulders. "What kind of practical considerations?" I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. Lisa consulted her phone, reading from what looked like a prepared list. Storage unit rental fees, truck maintenance costs, insurance considerations for Dad's tool collection, property taxes on items of value. These things add up quickly, especially on a librarian's salary. "We don't want you to end up losing money on Dad's legacy because you're too sentimental to make rational decisions." The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. My sister, who sold houses for a living, was warning me about property expenses while I sat there owning 12 rental properties that generated $18,000 in monthly income. Kevin, who'd built his career on reading market trends and identifying value, was advising me to dump assets that would make most investors weep with envy. We've been thinking, Kevin continued, maybe it would be better if we handled everything collectively. Pool all the inheritances together, sell what needs selling, divide the proceeds fairly. That way nobody gets stuck with unwanted responsibilities or unexpected costs. There it was. The real purpose of their coordinated intervention wasn't concern for my emotional well-being or worry about my financial stability. They wanted to renegotiate the inheritance distribution because their business instincts were telling them something was off. They couldn't identify exactly what was wrong with the picture, but they knew Dad's scraps felt more substantial than they'd initially calculated. I'm not ready to make those kinds of decisions yet, I said, sticking to the script Dad had outlined in his letter. Let them commit fully to their assumptions. Let them reveal exactly how they saw me and what they thought I deserved. I need more time to go through everything properly. Lisa's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing irritation underneath. Sarah, time isn't going to change the practical realities here. Every day you wait is another day of storage fees, insurance costs, and depreciation on items that might have value now, but won't later. As your sister, I have to tell you that delaying these decisions isn't in your best interest. Kevin nodded gravely, backing up his sister's assessment with the weight of his corporate expertise. Market timing matters, especially with vintage tools and automotive assets. The longer you hold on to Dad's truck, the more it's going to cost in maintenance, and the less it'll be worth to potential buyers. We're trying to help you maximize what Dad left you, but we can't do that if you won't let us. They were good, I had to admit. Their arguments sounded reasonable on the surface, wrapped in enough genuine concern to make their manipulation feel like generosity. If I'd actually been the overwhelmed, financially naive little sister they thought I was, I might have been grateful for their intervention. Instead, I was getting a masterclass in how my family really saw me, incompetent, emotional, and in need of protection from my own poor judgment. I understand you're trying to help, I said carefully, but this is something I need to handle myself. Dad left those things to me specifically, and I want to honor that by taking the time to understand what he intended. The silence that followed was loaded with frustration and calculation. Kevin and Lisa exchanged a look that probably would have been subtle if they'd practiced it more. They were clearly disappointed by my lack of cooperation, but they couldn't push too hard without revealing the self-interest behind their concern. Okay, Kevin said finally, his tone suggesting this was far from over. But if you change your mind, if this gets overwhelming, or you realize you're in over your head, we're here to help. Family takes care of family, even when it's complicated. After they left, I sat in my apartment feeling like I'd just survived an interrogation disguised as an intervention. Everything Dad had predicted was coming true with clockwork precision. The subtle pressure, the manufactured concern, the gradual erosion of my autonomy disguised as helpful suggestions. They weren't evil people, but they were small people, unable to see past their own assumptions about value and capability. Monday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Margaret Chen's secretary scheduled our second meeting for that afternoon, and I spent the intervening hours preparing for what felt like the most important conversation of my life. Dad's sealed envelope sat on my passenger seat as I drove downtown, its contents representing either the destruction or transformation of my family relationships. Margaret's office felt different this time, charged with the significance of what was about to happen. She'd clearly been preparing for this moment as thoroughly as Dad had, with additional documents spread across her desk and a recording device positioned prominently between us. Your father anticipated this would be a complicated situation, she began, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who'd handled difficult family dynamics before. He wanted everything documented clearly, both for legal protection and to ensure his intentions couldn't be misinterpreted or challenged later. She handed me a thick folder containing what looked like a comprehensive estate plan, complete with backup documentation, financial projections, and detailed instructions for managing the property portfolio. Before we proceed with revealing the full extent of your inheritance to your family, I need to make sure you understand the complete picture. This isn't just about surprising them with information they weren't expecting. This is about protecting assets worth millions of dollars from people who may not have your best interests at heart. The weight of responsibility was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about proving my family wrong or getting revenge for their condescension. I was about to become responsible for the livelihoods of dozens of tenants, the maintenance of 12 properties, and the continuation of a business Dad had spent decades building. The knowledge felt simultaneously empowering and terrifying. Margaret walked me through the practical realities of property management, the legal protections Dad had built into the business structure, and the financial projections showing how the portfolio could continue growing, if managed properly. She also outlined the potential challenges, from family members who might contest the inheritance to market fluctuations that could affect property values. Your father was very specific about who should and shouldn't have access to information about Martinez Holdings, she continued, pulling out another document. He created a detailed plan for revealing the truth to your family members, but only after they'd had sufficient opportunity to show their true motivations regarding your inheritance. The plan was characteristically thorough. Dad had anticipated every possible reaction, from Kevin's attempts to renegotiate the distribution to Lisa's claims that she could have managed the properties more effectively. He'd even predicted Uncle Bob's likely accusation that the whole thing was somehow fraudulent or suspicious. The key, Margaret explained, is timing. Your father wanted them to commit fully to their current positions before learning about the real estate empire. Once they've made their assumptions clear, once they've revealed how they really see you and what they think you deserve, then you share the truth. Not before. I thought about my weekend conversations with Kevin and Lisa, their carefully orchestrated intervention, their transparent attempts to gain control over what they still thought were Dad's modest leftovers. They'd certainly committed to their positions. The question now was whether I had the courage to follow through with Dad's plan. What if this destroys our family relationships permanently? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger each day. Margaret's expression softened slightly, revealing the human being behind the professional attorney facade. Your father asked me the same question when he was designing this plan. His response was that relationships built on false assumptions about your worth and capabilities weren't relationships worth preserving. He believed that real family love would survive the truth, while manipulation disguised as concern would reveal itself for what it really was. She opened Dad's final letter, the one I was supposed to read before making my decision about revealing the inheritance. His handwriting filled 2 pages, and his words carried the weight of a man who'd spent months thinking about this moment. My dear Sarah, the letter began, if you're reading this with Margaret, then you've spent a week watching your family reveal exactly who they are when they think you have nothing of value. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm also proud that you were strong enough to wait and observe before acting. That patience and careful judgment is exactly why you're the right person to inherit what I've built. He went on to address each family member specifically, showing a deeper understanding of their personalities than I'd realized he possessed. About Kevin, your brother sees every relationship as a transaction, and every person as either an asset or a liability. He'll never understand that building wealth isn't about taking from others, it's about creating value that benefits everyone involved. About Lisa. Your sister has confused professional success with personal worth. She thinks selling houses makes her an expert on property investment, but she's never understood the difference between moving real estate and building lasting value. About Uncle Bob. Bob has spent his whole life wanting to be the patriarch of this family without earning that respect through actual wisdom or generosity. He'll see your inheritance as a threat to the authority he's never actually possessed. The letter's conclusion was both a warning and a promise. They're going to be angry, Sarah. They're going to feel cheated and betrayed and confused about how their assumptions could have been so wrong. Some of that anger will be directed at you, and some at me, and some at themselves for missing what was happening right in front of them. But remember that their anger comes from embarrassment, not injustice. They got exactly what they deserved based on how they treated both of us. You got what you deserved based on who you are as a person. What you do with this inheritance is up to you. Dad's letter continued, you can sell everything and live comfortably for the rest of your life, or you can build on what I started and create something even bigger. You can forgive your family immediately, or make them work to earn back your trust. You can be generous with people who were never generous with you, or you can protect yourself from people who see you as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Whatever you choose, remember that you have options now. Real options, and that's something they can never take away from you again. Reading Dad's words felt like receiving advice from beyond the grave, except the advice was perfectly tailored to circumstances he'd engineered specifically for my benefit. He'd spent years not just building financial wealth, but constructing a situation that would reveal everyone's true character, while giving me the power to respond from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. Margaret watched me finish the letter before speaking again.
Whoa!
Your father loved you very much, Sarah, but more than that, he respected you. Everything he built was a testament to his belief in your character and judgment. The question now is whether you're ready to claim what he created for you. I thought about the past week, watching my family circle around what they thought were Dad's modest remains like sharks smelling blood in the water. Their concern for my well-being had been transparently self-serving, their offers to help obviously designed to benefit themselves. Dad had given them every opportunity to show genuine love and support, and they'd chosen manipulation and condescension instead. I'm ready, I said, and meant it. Margaret smiled, and reached for her phone. Excellent, let's schedule a family meeting for tomorrow afternoon. I think it's time your relatives learned exactly what your father thought of their assumptions about value and worth. That evening, I called Kevin, Lisa, and Uncle Bob to invite them to what I described as a meeting with Dad's attorney to finalize the inheritance details. I kept my voice neutral and slightly defeated, playing into their expectations about my emotional state and decision-making capabilities. Each of them agreed to attend with an eagerness that confirmed everything Dad had predicted about their motivations. Kevin immediately asked whether this meant I was ready to be reasonable about the practical considerations we'd discussed. Lisa wanted to know if I'd finally realized the importance of professional guidance in estate matters. Uncle Bob assumed I'd come to my senses about trying to handle everything alone. None of them asked how I was feeling, or whether I needed emotional support. They were focused entirely on what they stood to gain from my apparent capitulation. I spent my final evening of secret knowledge walking through Dad's properties one last time, seeing them now as both his legacy and my future responsibility. The duplex on Grove Street, where Mrs. Rodriguez was teaching her grandson to ride a bicycle in the driveway. The apartment building on Pine Avenue, where the Johnsons had hung wind chimes that made music in the evening breeze. The commercial building downtown where people went about their daily business, buying groceries and getting haircuts, and preparing tax returns in spaces Dad had carefully maintained and improved. This wasn't just about money or property, or proving my family wrong about my capabilities. This was about continuing something Dad had started, maintaining the homes and businesses and communities he'd invested in both financially and emotionally. The tenants who depended on fair rent and responsive maintenance. The neighborhoods he'd helped stabilize and improve. The legacy of treating people with dignity while building something sustainable and valuable. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the family dynamics that had shaped my entire adult life would be permanently altered by knowledge that couldn't be unknown or ignored. Tomorrow I would stop being the little sister who got the scraps and start being the woman who inherited the kingdom. But tonight, I sat in Dad's truck outside the storage unit that contained the documentation of his life's work, listening to the engine make its familiar grinding sound and thinking about the last conversation we'd had before his heart attack. He'd seemed different that day, more serious than usual, like he was trying to tell me something important without actually saying the words. You know, Sarah, he'd said, looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding, sometimes the most valuable things are the ones people don't notice right away. Takes patience to see what's really there, underneath all the surface appearances. I'd thought he was talking about the carburetor, about how broken-looking car parts could be restored to perfect function with enough knowledge and effort. Now I understood he was talking about me, about his belief that I had value my family couldn't see, potential they'd never bothered to recognize. The inheritance wasn't just his gift to me. It was his gift to both of us, the vindication he'd never lived to see, but had carefully orchestrated from beyond the grave. Tomorrow at Margaret Chen's office, surrounded by documents and lawyers, and family members, who thought they were gathering to witness my admission of defeat, I would read Dad's final letter aloud, and watch their faces, as they realized exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Tomorrow I would stop pretending to be grateful for scraps, and start claiming the empire that had been mine all along. Tuesday afternoon arrived with the weight of inevitability. I dressed carefully for the meeting at Margaret Chen's office, choosing clothes that maintained the image my family expected, modest, slightly overwhelmed, grateful for their guidance. The performance felt strange now that I knew the truth, like wearing a costume that no longer fit properly. But Dad's plan required one final act of seeming vulnerability before the curtain fell on their assumptions forever. I arrived at the law office early, wanting time to review the documents one last time before my family descended with their rehearsed concern and barely concealed avarice. Margaret had arranged everything with theatrical precision. The conference table was set with copies of incorporation papers, property deeds, financial statements, and rental agreements. A projector displayed a map showing all 12 properties, each marked with acquisition dates and current values. The visual impact was designed to be overwhelming, a flood of information that would make denial impossible. Kevin arrived first, precisely on time and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested he'd prepared his own documents for the meeting. He wore his most expensive suit, and the confident expression of someone who expected to control the conversation. His greeting was warm but calculating, the kind of professional friendliness he probably used with clients he was about to close. "Sarah, you look good," he said, though his eyes were already scanning the conference room for clues about what was coming. "I'm proud of you for taking this step. Getting professional help with estate matters shows real maturity." The condescension was automatic now, so deeply ingrained he probably didn't even notice it anymore. Lisa entered with her usual efficiency, phone in one hand, and a coffee in the other, multitasking even during family crises. She dressed for success, in a tailored blazer and heels that clicked authoritatively against the marble floor. Her real estate agent instincts were clearly activated by the formal legal setting, and she was already positioning herself as the expert who would guide everyone through the complex property-related decisions ahead. Uncle Bob was the last to arrive, and his entrance confirmed everything Dad had predicted about his motivations. He carried a manila folder thick with documents and wore the self-important expression of someone who'd appointed himself the family's financial advisor. His first action was to survey the room, like he was calculating square footage, his car salesman instincts automatically assessing the value of everything, from the furniture to Margaret's law degree hanging on the wall. Margaret entered precisely at 2 o'clock, her presence immediately shifting the room's energy from casual family gathering to serious legal proceeding. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd handled hundreds of estate revelations, but I could see she was particularly invested in this one. Dad had clearly briefed her thoroughly on our family dynamics, and she seemed genuinely curious to see whether his predictions would prove accurate. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, settling into her chair with practiced professionalism. "I know this has been a difficult time for your family, and I appreciate your patience as we've worked through the legal requirements for finalizing Mr. Martinez's estate. Today's meeting will clarify some matters that have been pending since the funeral." Kevin immediately took charge, or tried to. "Before we begin," he said, opening his portfolio with corporate efficiency, "I'd like to review the preliminary asset distribution we discussed last week. I've prepared some documentation that might help streamline the process and ensure everyone's interests are properly protected." The presumption was breathtaking. Kevin was attempting to run a meeting in a lawyer's office about an estate he knew nothing about, confident that his business experience qualified him to manage legal matters he didn't understand. Lisa nodded approvingly at his initiative, clearly seeing this as the kind of take-charge leadership their family needed. Margaret's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested professional irritation. "I appreciate your preparation, Mr. Martinez, but today's meeting is specifically about information that wasn't available during your initial family discussions. Information that significantly changes the scope and nature of your father's estate." Uncle Bob leaned forward, his salesman instincts detecting something important happening beneath the surface. "What kind of information?" David was pretty straightforward about his finances. Worked the same job for 30 years, lived in the same house, drove the same truck. There weren't any surprises in his lifestyle. The irony of that statement was so perfect, I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Uncle Bob's complete confidence in his assessment of Dad's financial situation was about to become the foundation of his embarrassment. Margaret glanced at me, a subtle check to make sure I was ready for what was coming. "Miss Martinez," Margaret said, addressing me
Directly, your father left specific instructions about how today's information should be presented. Would you like to begin by reading his letter? Or would you prefer that I explain the business structure first? The moment felt crystalline, balanced on the edge between my old life and whatever came next. My family was looking at me with expressions ranging from patient indulgence to mild irritation, still thinking this meeting was about finalizing the modest inheritance they'd already divided among themselves.
In 30 seconds, that comfortable certainty would explode into fragments they'd never be able to reassemble. "I'll read Dad's letter," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Margaret handed me the document, and I unfolded it slowly, buying time to observe my family's faces one last time before everything changed. Kevin was checking his watch, clearly thinking about whatever important business meeting he had later. Lisa was scrolling through her phone, probably reviewing property listings or client messages. Uncle Bob was studying the law office's decor, mentally calculating what Margaret's hourly rate might be. None of them were paying serious attention to what was happening. They were here as a formality, a necessary step in managing what they still believed was a simple estate distribution. Their casual dismissal of the moment felt like the final insult, the last proof that Dad's predictions about their character had been absolutely accurate. "My dear family," I began, reading Dad's carefully chosen words aloud. "If Sarah is reading this letter to you, then you've spent the past week demonstrating exactly why she was the right choice to inherit what I spent 25 years building." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Kevin's head snapped up from his portfolio. Lisa's phone disappeared into her purse. Uncle Bob's casual surveying of the office stopped mid-glance. Suddenly they were paying attention with the intensity of people who sensed their comfortable assumptions were about to be challenged. I continued reading, Dad's voice seeming to fill the room through his written words. "For most of my adult life, you've seen me as David Martinez, the maintenance supervisor who lived modestly and had simple dreams. You saw the old truck, the small house, the working-class job, and you assumed that was the complete picture of who I was and what I'd accomplished." Kevin started to interrupt, but Margaret held up a hand that stopped him cold. This was Dad's moment, his carefully orchestrated revelation, and it would proceed according to his timeline rather than anyone else's convenience. "What you never understood," the letter continued, "was that everything you saw was a choice. I chose to live modestly, I chose to drive an old truck. I chose to keep working a job I'd already outgrown financially. I made those choices because they allowed me to build something much bigger without attracting attention or interference from people who would have wanted to manage my decisions for me." Lisa's real estate instincts were clearly activated now, her professional antennae detecting the approaching revelation of property-related information. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying a new urgency, "what exactly is Dad talking about? What did he build?" Instead of answering directly, I continued reading Dad's letter, letting his words create the foundation for what Margaret was about to reveal. "Over the past 25 years, I acquired 12 rental properties, 1 commercial building, 4 development lots, and investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The total value of what I built is approximately $2.3 million. And I left all of it to Sarah." The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin's mouth actually fell open, his corporate composure evaporating as he processed numbers that didn't fit his understanding of reality. Lisa went pale, her real estate expertise making her immediately understand the implications of what she'd just heard. Uncle Bob looked like someone had punched him in the stomach, his self-appointed authority over family financial matters suddenly revealed as completely illusory. "That's impossible," Kevin said finally, his voice tight with disbelief. "Dad worked maintenance, he lived paycheck to paycheck. There's no way he had millions of dollars in real estate." Margaret stepped in smoothly, her professional demeanor shifting into presentation mode. "Actually, Mr. Martinez, your father was one of the most successful real estate investors in this county. He simply chose to keep his business activities private." She activated the projector, filling the wall with the map of Dad's properties. "Martinez Holdings LLC owns these 12 rental properties, generating approximately $18,000 in monthly income." The visual impact was devastating. 12 pins scattered across 2 counties, each representing a property my family had never known existed. Kevin stared at the map like it was written in a foreign language, his business brain struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about Dad's financial situation. Lisa recovered first, her professional training kicking in as she studied the property locations. "These are in good neighborhoods," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Some of these areas have appreciated significantly over the past decade. If he bought these properties when they were undervalued." "He did," Margaret confirmed, advancing to the next slide showing purchase dates and prices. "Your father had an exceptional eye for identifying properties with potential. He would buy distressed homes, renovate them himself, and either sell them for profit or keep them as rental income. Over time, he transitioned to keeping more properties than he sold, building a portfolio that generates substantial passive income. Uncle Bob found his voice, though it came out strangled and confused. But the house on Maple Street, his lifestyle, the way he lived, none of this makes sense. If David had millions of dollars, why did he keep working? Why did he drive that old truck? The questions revealed everything Dad had known about Uncle Bob's character. His confusion wasn't about the financial strategy, which was actually quite brilliant. His confusion was about why someone with wealth would choose not to display it, not to use it for status or social positioning. The concept of stealth wealth was incomprehensible to someone who equated success with visible consumption. Margaret advanced to the financial statements, showing years of rental income, property appreciation, and investment growth. Your father's approach was methodical and conservative. He reinvested profits into acquiring additional properties rather than upgrading his lifestyle. The result was a business that grew consistently while remaining completely under the radar. Kevin was studying the numbers now, his corporate training finally engaging with the reality of what Dad had accomplished. The cash flow alone is more than most people's salaries, he said, his voice carrying a new respect that had been completely absent a week ago. If he was generating this kind of income, he could have lived like a millionaire. He was a millionaire, I said quietly, reading further into Dad's letter. He just chose to live like himself. The next section of the letter was directed specifically at Kevin, and Dad's understanding of his son's personality was painfully accurate. Kevin, I continued reading, you'll want to know why I didn't tell you about the business, or offer you a partnership. The answer is simple: you've spent your entire adult life trying to impress people with what you own instead of who you are. You would have wanted to leverage the properties for bigger deals, flashier investments, riskier strategies. You would have turned my sustainable business into a showcase for your ambition, and you would have lost everything trying to get rich faster. Kevin's face flushed red, the accuracy of Dad's assessment hitting like a physical blow. Everything in his expression confirmed that Dad had read him perfectly. Even now, I could see Kevin's mind racing with ideas about how the portfolio could be expanded, leveraged, optimized for maximum return. The conservative approach that had built lasting wealth was already feeling inadequate to his corporate sensibilities. The letter continued with Lisa, and Dad's analysis of her character was equally precise. Lisa, you'll think you could have managed these properties more effectively because you work in real estate. But selling houses and building rental income are completely different skills. You understand transactions, not relationships. You know how to move properties quickly, not how to maintain them for decades. My tenants stayed because I treated them fairly and kept their homes in excellent condition. You would have seen them as income sources to be maximized rather than people to be served. Lisa's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing hurt underneath the confident facade. That's not fair, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I help families find homes. I understand the importance of treating people well. Do you? I asked, still following Dad's script. When was the last time you visited one of your clients after closing? When was the last time you helped a former buyer with a maintenance issue or a neighbor dispute? Dad's business worked because he built relationships that lasted years, not transactions that ended at closing. Margaret displayed the next set of documents, showing tenant histories and rental agreements going back years. Your father's average tenant stayed for over 4 years, which is exceptional in rental property management. His maintenance response time was typically under 24 hours. His rental increases averaged less than market rate because he prioritized stable, long-term tenants over maximum short-term profit. The evidence painted a picture of someone who'd understood real estate investment at a level none of them had imagined possible. Dad hadn't just been buying and holding properties. He'd been building a community, creating value that went beyond financial returns, to include social responsibility and genuine care for the people who lived in his buildings. Uncle Bob was the last to be addressed in Dad's letter, and his section was the most devastating of all. Bob, I read aloud, you've spent 30 years giving financial advice to family members who never asked for it, based on expertise you've never actually demonstrated. You sell cars for a living, which requires different skills than building wealth. You've confused confidence with competence, and you've convinced yourself that being older makes you wiser about money. The truth is that while you were talking about investment strategies, I was actually implementing them. The silence that followed was loaded with embarrassment and growing anger. Uncle Bob's face had gone from confused to defensive, his self-appointed role as family patriarch suddenly revealed as entirely self-invented. This is all very impressive, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, but it doesn't change the fact that the inheritance distribution was already settled. Sarah got what she got, and the rest of us got what we got. Margaret's smile was sharp and professional. Actually, Mr. Martinez, the inheritance distribution you're referring to was never legally binding. It was a family agreement based on assumptions about Mr. David Martinez's assets that were completely incorrect. The only legal inheritance document is his will, which leaves the entirety of Martinez Holdings LLC to Sarah. The revelation hit like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Kevin's portfolio slipped from his hands, papers scattering across the conference table. Lisa's professional mask finally cracked completely, revealing shock and calculation in equal measure. Uncle Bob looked like he was having trouble breathing, his assumed authority over family finances evaporating before his eyes. "What about the house?" Kevin asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "The savings account. The life insurance." Margaret consulted another document, her tone professionally neutral. "The house on Maple Street was never actually owned by your father. It's a rental property belonging to Martinez Holdings LLC, which your father occupied at below market rent. The savings account contains $8,000, which represents petty cash for household expenses. The life insurance policy was cashed out 5 years ago to fund property acquisitions. The systematic destruction of their assumptions was almost surgical in its precision. Every piece of the inheritance they divided among themselves was either worthless or non-existent. The house Kevin thought he'd inherited was just another rental property in a portfolio he now had no claim to. The financial accounts Lisa had assumed were hers contained barely enough money to cover a month of Dad's modest living expenses. "So what do we get?" Lisa asked, her real estate training helping her cut through emotional confusion to focus on practical realities. "If Sarah inherits everything, what's left for the rest of the family?" I looked at Dad's letter for the answer, knowing he would have addressed this question with the same careful consideration he'd given everything else. "Each of you gets exactly what you valued when you thought I had nothing," I read aloud. "Kevin gets his sense of superiority over his simple father. Lisa gets her confidence that professional success equals real expertise. Bob gets his conviction that age automatically confers wisdom. Those were the only things you ever wanted from our relationship anyway." The brutal honesty of Dad's assessment left them speechless. He'd identified the core of each person's condescension and handed it back to them as their inheritance. They'd treated him and me like charity cases who needed their guidance and protection, and now they were discovering that the charity case was actually wealthier than all of them combined. Kevin was the first to recover, his corporate instincts engaging with what he was beginning to recognize as a serious financial opportunity. "Look, Sarah, this is obviously a shock for everyone, but we're still family, and family should work together on important decisions. Managing a portfolio this size is complicated. You're going to need help, professional guidance." "From who?" I interrupted, finally speaking for myself instead of reading Dad's words. "From the brother who spent the past week telling me I couldn't handle a storage unit full of tools. From the sister who wanted to take over selling Dad's junk because she was worried I'd get taken advantage of. From the uncle who divided up Dad's estate like he had any authority to make those decisions." The questions hung in the air like accusations, which was exactly what they were. For the past week, they'd revealed their true opinions about my capabilities and judgment. Now they wanted to position themselves as the expert help I desperately needed, but their credibility was in ruins. Lisa tried a different approach, her real estate background making her understand the practical implications better than the others. "Sarah, setting aside everything that's happened in the past week, you have to admit this is a huge responsibility. 12 properties, dozens of tenants, maintenance issues, legal requirements. It's essentially a full-time job. Are you really prepared to quit working at the library to become a property manager?" It was a reasonable question, delivered in a reasonable tone, but it carried the same underlying assumption that had defined their treatment of me for years. Lisa couldn't imagine that I might be capable of managing complex responsibilities because she'd never seen me in anything other than my modest librarian role. The possibility that I might have hidden depths or untapped potential was literally inconceivable to her. Margaret stepped in before I could respond, pulling out another set of documents that represented the final layer of Dad's planning. "Actually, your father anticipated that concern and made provisions for it. Sarah won't need to quit her job because Martinez Holdings LLC employs a property management company for day-to-day operations. Her role as owner is primarily strategic rather than operational." The revelation added another dimension to Dad's sophisticated planning. He hadn't just built a real estate empire and left me to figure out how to manage it. He'd created a system that would allow me to maintain my current life while benefiting from the wealth he'd accumulated. The business could run itself while I decided what kind of larger role I wanted to play in its future. Furthermore, Margaret continued, Mr. Martinez established a trust structure that protects the assets from potential claims or challenges. The inheritance is secure, legally documented, and completely beyond dispute. Ms. Martinez has full authority to make decisions about the portfolio without input or approval from anyone else. The finality of that statement settled over the room like a blanket of silence. There would be no renegotiation, no family collaboration, no democratic decision-making about how Dad's wealth should be managed. He'd chosen his heir deliberately and protected that choice with legal structures that couldn't be challenged or circumvented. Uncle Bob made one last attempt to assert some kind of authority over the situation. This whole thing feels suspicious to me. David working maintenance while secretly managing millions of dollars in real estate. It doesn't add up. There should be an investigation, maybe an audit to make sure everything was handled properly. Margaret's response was swift and professional. Mr. Martinez, I understand this information is surprising, but everything was handled with complete legal compliance. Martinez Holdings LLC has been filing taxes, maintaining business licenses, and operating under full regulatory oversight for 8 years. If you'd like to review the documentation, I can provide copies of all relevant filings. The offer to review the paperwork was clearly a challenge rather than a genuine invitation. Margaret knew that Uncle Bob's bluster was motivated by embarrassment rather than legitimate concern about legal compliance. His threat of investigation was the desperate reaction of someone whose worldview had just been shattered by information he couldn't process or control. Kevin tried one more approach, this time targeting me directly. Sarah, I know you're angry about how we handled things last week. Maybe we were presumptuous about the inheritance distribution. But don't let hurt feelings cloud your judgment about what's best for everyone. This portfolio could benefit the whole family if it's managed properly. The word properly carried all the condescension they'd been directing at me for years, concentrated into a single syllable. Kevin was still assuming that proper management required his involvement, that I couldn't be trusted to handle important decisions without guidance from people he considered more qualified. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of my inheritance, he couldn't accept that Dad had chosen me specifically because of who I was, rather than despite my limitations. You're right, I said, standing up to signal that the meeting was ending. I am angry about how you handled things last week, but not because of hurt feelings. I'm angry because you showed me exactly who you are when you thought I had nothing worth taking. And now that you know I have something valuable, you want to pretend that week never happened. Margaret began gathering documents, clearly recognizing that the revelation phase of the meeting was complete. Miss Martinez, I'll need you to sign some final paperwork to complete the transfer of authority, but the business is essentially yours to manage as you see fit. Your father included detailed instructions for operations, but all major decisions are now yours to make. As my family filed out of the conference room, their faces showed a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and calculation that confirmed everything Dad had predicted about their characters. They weren't thinking about how happy they should be for my good fortune, or how proud they should be of Dad's remarkable achievement. They were thinking about how this new information affected their own positions, and what strategies they might use to benefit from my changed circumstances. Kevin paused at the door, clearly planning to continue the conversation outside the formal legal setting. Lisa was already on her phone, probably researching property management companies or investment strategies. Uncle Bob looked like he was preparing to call other family members, spreading the news and possibly building a coalition for challenging what he still couldn't accept as legitimate. None of them congratulated me. None of them expressed admiration for Dad's accomplishment or joy at learning their modest father had actually been a financial genius. Their reactions were entirely self-centered, focused on what my inheritance meant for them rather than what it meant for me or what it revealed about the man who'd built it. As I signed the final documents transferring control of Martinez Holdings LLC into my name, I thought about Dad's prediction that this revelation would show everyone's true character. He'd been absolutely right. The people who dismissed me as incapable of handling my small inheritance were now calculating how to position themselves to benefit from my vast one. The family members who'd patronized me for being emotionally overwhelmed were now the ones struggling to process information that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. Walking out of Margaret's office, I felt the weight of transformation settling around me like a new skin. The woman who'd entered that conference room was still Sarah Martinez, the librarian who drove an old truck and lived modestly. But she was also now Sarah Martinez, property empire owner and multimillionaire. The two identities would need time to reconcile, but for the first time in my adult life, I had the luxury of time to figure out who I wanted to become. The first 24 hours after the revelation were a masterclass in family damage control gone wrong. My phone started ringing before I'd even made it home from Margaret's office, and it didn't stop for the rest of the evening. Kevin called 6 times, each message more desperate than the last. Lisa sent a series of increasingly frantic texts ranging from apologies to business proposition. Uncle Bob left one voicemail that managed to cycle through denial, anger, bargaining, and acceptance all in under 3 minutes. I let them all go to voicemail while I sat in Dad's old truck outside the storage unit, holding the keys to an empire I was still learning to comprehend. The familiar grinding sound of the engine seemed different now, not like a sign of poverty, but like the deliberate choice of a man who understood the difference between wealth and status. Dad had driven this truck while owning properties worth millions, and somehow that made perfect sense. Kevin's final message of the night was the most revealing. His corporate composure had completely cracked, replaced by the wheedling tone of someone who'd realized he'd massively miscalculated. "Sarah, we need to talk about this situation rationally. I know things got heated today, but we're still family. I've been thinking about investment strategies that could really maximize the portfolio's potential. We could leverage some properties to acquire more, maybe look into commercial development opportunities. I have connections in the business world that could be really valuable. Call me back. This is important." The message confirmed everything Dad had predicted about Kevin's character. Faced with evidence of a successful real estate strategy, his immediate instinct was to change it, to make it bigger and flashier and more complex. The conservative approach that had built sustainable wealth wasn't enough for his corporate sensibilities. He needed optimization, leverage, expansion, all the buzzwords that sounded impressive in boardrooms, but destroyed more wealth than they created. Lisa's text messages followed a similar pattern, evolving from shock denial to transparent self-interest over the course of 6 hours. Her first message was pure emotion. "I can't believe Dad kept this from us. How could he build something this big without telling anyone?" By her third message, she was offering professional services. "I've been researching the neighborhoods where Dad bought properties. Some are zoned for higher density development. We should discuss maximizing the land value." Her final message of the night was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as concern. "Sarah, managing 12 properties is overwhelming even for experienced investors. I could help transition some of the single-family homes to multifamily developments. Higher income potential, better long-term value." Uncle Bob's voicemail was the most pathetic of all. His shock had curdled into resentment, and his message carried the bitter tone of someone whose self-appointed authority had been publicly demolished. "This whole thing doesn't make sense, Sarah. David never showed any business sense, never talked about investments or property management. Something's not right here. Maybe that lawyer convinced him to sign things he didn't understand. Maybe there's elder abuse involved. We should get a second opinion before you make any major decisions. I know people who could investigate this properly." The suggestion that Dad had been manipulated or confused was so insulting it took my breath away. Uncle Bob couldn't accept that his younger brother had been building wealth while he was selling used cars and dispensing unsolicited financial advice. The possibility that David Martinez had been smarter, more successful, and more strategic than anyone in the family realized was literally unthinkable to someone whose entire identity was built on being the family's business expert. I spent that first night reading through more of Dad's property files, understanding for the first time the scope of what he'd accomplished and the care with which he'd planned my inheritance. Each property folder contained not just financial records, but personal notes about tenants, detailed maintenance schedules, and improvement plans that stretched years into the future. This wasn't just a business to him. It was a legacy built on relationships, and sustained by genuine concern for the people who lived in his buildings. The most moving discovery was a separate folder labeled, "For Sarah's Reference," containing detailed explanations of his investment philosophy, property management principles, and advice for handling various tenant situations. Dad had essentially written me a manual for running the business, anticipating questions I hadn't even thought to ask yet. His final note in that folder was both instruction and benediction. "Trust your instincts, treat people fairly, and remember that real wealth comes from creating value for others, not extracting it from them." Wednesday morning brought a new wave of family pressure, this time coordinated and strategic. Kevin and Lisa arrived at my apartment together, clearly having spent the evening planning their approach. They brought coffee and pastries, staging props for what they probably thought was a casual family conversation. Their body language screamed corporate presentation, from Kevin's leather portfolio to Lisa's tablet loaded with property research. "We've been thinking," Kevin began, settling into my small living room, like he was claiming territory, "about how to approach this situation constructively. What Dad built is remarkable, but it's also just the beginning. With proper management and strategic expansion, this portfolio could become something really significant. Lisa pulled up charts on her tablet, displaying property values and market trends with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her professional calling. I've analyzed all 12 properties, and the potential for value appreciation is enormous. Some of these neighborhoods are on the verge of major gentrification. If we act now, we could triple the portfolio's value within 5 years. Their presentation was polished and professional, the kind of strategic planning session that probably impressed corporate clients and real estate investors. But it completely missed the point of what Dad had built. They were seeing properties where he'd seen homes, viewing tenants as income sources, where he'd seen people deserving respect and stability. Their vision for maximizing potential would have destroyed everything he'd worked to create. What about the current tenants? I asked, testing their understanding of Dad's business model. Kevin waved the question away like it was a minor detail. Market rate adjustments, property improvements to justify higher rents, maybe conversion to short-term rentals in the better locations. There are lots of options for optimizing revenue streams. The casual dismissal of long-term tenants revealed everything I needed to know about their
approach. They weren't interested in continuing Dad's legacy of fair, stable housing. They wanted to extract maximum profit regardless of the human cost, treating people like interchangeable units in a financial equation. Dad kept rents below market rate on purpose, I said, pulling out his notes about tenant relationships. Mrs. Rodriguez has lived in the Grove Street duplex for 6 years and helped him maintain the garden. The Johnson family on Pine Avenue has been there for 4 years, and their kids play safely in the courtyard Dad landscaped specifically for them. These aren't just revenue streams, they're people whose lives Dad improved by providing stable, affordable housing. Lisa's expression showed polite incomprehension, the look of someone encountering a business philosophy that didn't compute with her professional training. That's very sweet, Sarah, but it's not sustainable in the current market. Property taxes are rising, maintenance costs are increasing, and inflation affects operating expenses. You can't run a business on sentiment. The comment revealed the fundamental difference between her understanding of real estate and Dad's approach. She saw property management as a series of transactions optimized for maximum return. Dad had seen it as a long-term relationship business where treating people well created stability that was itself valuable. His low tenant turnover, minimal vacancy rates, and excellent property conditions weren't accidents. They were the natural result of a business model based on mutual respect rather than pure profit extraction. Kevin tried a different angle, appealing to what he assumed were my practical concerns about managing such a large operation. Look, Sarah, I know you're attached to Dad's way of doing things, but you have to be realistic about your own capabilities here. 12 properties means dozens of tenants, hundreds of maintenance requests, legal compliance issues, tax complications. It's essentially a full-time job that requires specific expertise you don't have. The assumption that I lacked the intelligence or capability to learn property management was so casually insulting it almost felt routine. Kevin couldn't imagine that his librarian sister might be capable of understanding business operations or developing new skills. In his mind, complex tasks required people like him, credentialed professionals with corporate experience and business school vocabularies. Margaret explained that Dad hired a property management company to handle day-to-day operations. I said, enjoying the flicker of surprise that crossed Kevin's face. My role is primarily oversight and strategic decision-making. The business essentially runs itself while I decide what direction to take it. The revelation that Dad had already solved the operational challenges deflated some of Kevin's arguments, but it also shifted his approach toward more direct manipulation. That's great short-term, but property management companies charge substantial fees that eat into profits. With family involvement, we could handle management internally and keep more of the revenue. I could oversee the business operations while Lisa handles property acquisition and development. You'd still be the owner, but with professional support that maximizes your returns. The proposal was sleek and logical, wrapped in language about family cooperation and professional expertise. What it actually represented was a complete takeover of Dad's business by people who would fundamentally change its character and purpose. They wanted to transform his relationship-based operation into a profit extraction machine, using his wealth to fund their ambitions while marginalizing my role to figurehead owner. What would my actual responsibilities be in this arrangement? I asked, curious to see how they'd disguise their planned coup. Lisa consulted her tablet, reading from notes she'd clearly prepared in advance.
You'd be the primary decision maker for major strategic choices, with Kevin and me providing analysis and recommendations based on our professional expertise. Day-to-day management would be handled by our team, freeing you to focus on big-picture planning and investment strategy. The language was carefully chosen to sound empowering while describing a situation where I'd be isolated from actual business operations and dependent on their analysis and recommendations for all important decisions. They were offering to relieve me of the burden of actually running the business while ensuring they controlled everything that mattered. Uncle Bob's arrival interrupted their presentation, and his approach was characteristically blunt and self-serving. He didn't bring coffee or charts or strategic planning documents. He brought accusations and demands for answers, convinced that the entire inheritance situation was somehow fraudulent or suspicious. "I've been making some calls," he announced, settling into my kitchen like he was conducting an investigation. "Talking to people who knew David, checking with the city about business licenses and property records. This whole Martinez Holdings thing seems awfully convenient, doesn't it? David works maintenance for 30 years, never mentions real estate investments, then suddenly dies and leaves millions to one daughter, while the rest of the family gets nothing." The conspiracy theory was so absurd it would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. Uncle Bob was essentially accusing Dad of posthumous fraud, unable to accept that his younger brother had been more successful and strategic than anyone realized. His investigation was clearly motivated by embarrassment rather than legitimate concern, a desperate attempt to find some flaw in the inheritance that would restore his damaged ego. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. Bob's expression took on the self-righteous indignation of someone who'd convinced himself he was protecting the family from deception. "I'm suggesting that maybe David didn't understand what he was signing. Maybe that lawyer took advantage of an elderly man who was grieving his wife and dealing with health problems. Maybe this whole LLC business was set up without proper family consultation, and maybe there are legal grounds for challenging the inheritance distribution." The suggestion that Dad had been incompetent or manipulated was the final insult, revealing Uncle Bob's complete inability to accept reality that didn't conform to his assumptions. Rather than acknowledging that David Martinez had been smarter and more successful than anyone gave him credit for, Bob was constructing elaborate theories about elder abuse and legal manipulation. Kevin and Lisa exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Uncle Bob's accusatory approach but not entirely opposed to the idea of challenging the inheritance if it could be done more subtly. Their corporate instincts recognized that direct confrontation was less effective than patient undermining of my confidence and capability. "Nobody's suggesting Dad was incompetent," Kevin said diplomatically, trying to distance himself from Bob's crude accusations while keeping options open. "But it is unusual for someone to build a business this size without family involvement or consultation. Maybe Dad intended for the inheritance to be managed collectively, and the legal documents don't fully reflect his wishes." The attempt to rewrite Dad's intentions was masterful manipulation, planting seeds of doubt about whether I was really supposed to inherit everything or just serve as a trustee for family assets. Kevin was suggesting that Dad's explicit, legally documented choice to leave everything to me was somehow a miscommunication or oversight that should be corrected through family negotiation. Lisa nodded supportively, adding her own professional credibility to Kevin's speculation. "In my experience with estate planning, it's common for property owners to designate one family member as the official heir while expecting that person to involve other family members in major decisions. The legal structure might show single ownership, but the real intention could be collaborative management." Their coordinated attempt to gaslight me about Dad's clear intentions was both impressive and infuriating. They were trying to convince me that my inheritance was actually a family inheritance that I was supposed to share, despite overwhelming legal evidence that Dad had specifically chosen me as the sole beneficiary, and gone to great lengths to protect that choice from challenge. "Dad left very specific instructions about his intentions," I said, pulling out his letter and reading the relevant section aloud. "He wrote, 'I'm leaving everything to Sarah, because she's the only one who understood that wealth should be built to serve people, not the other way around. The others will want to optimize and leverage and expand, but they'll destroy what I built in the process. Sarah will preserve what matters while growing what's possible.'" The direct quotation from Dad's letter effectively ended their speculation about his real intentions, but it also hardened their resolve to find some way around his explicit wishes. Uncle Bob's face darkened with resentment, Kevin's corporate mask slipped to reveal calculation, and Lisa's professional composure tightened with barely concealed frustration. David always did play favorites, Bob muttered, his comment revealing decades of resentment about family dynamics he'd never understood. Sarah was always his pet project, could do no wrong in his eyes. Maybe his judgment was clouded by sentiment instead of practical considerations about who could actually handle this kind of responsibility. The accusation that Dad's choice was based on favoritism rather than careful assessment of character was the kind of self-serving explanation that allowed Uncle Bob to preserve his ego while dismissing evidence that contradicted his assumptions. Rather than acknowledging that I might actually be the best choice to inherit the business, he was reframing Dad's decision as emotional bias that overcame rational judgment. Kevin tried to salvage the conversation by returning to practical arguments about business management and family cooperation. Regardless of Dad's specific intentions, we still need to think about what's best for everyone involved. Managing a property portfolio requires diverse skills and significant time investment. Even if you're officially the owner, Sarah, it makes sense to involve family members who can contribute expertise and support. The persistence was remarkable. Despite clear legal documentation, explicit written instructions from Dad, and my obvious reluctance to involve them in business operations, they were still pushing for some form of control or participation in the inheritance. Their inability to accept that they'd been excluded from Dad's wealth wasn't just about money. It was about their fundamental belief that important decisions required their input and approval. I appreciate your concern, I said, standing up, to signal that the conversation was ending, but I'm comfortable with Dad's arrangement. The business is running successfully, the tenants are happy, and the property management company has everything under control. I don't need additional help or family involvement. The finality of my statement created a moment of tense silence as they processed the reality that their various arguments and strategies had failed. Kevin's corporate charm couldn't overcome legal documents, Lisa's professional expertise couldn't trump Dad's explicit instructions, and Uncle Bob's accusations couldn't change facts that were thoroughly documented and verified. Their departure was awkward and loaded with unspoken threats about future challenges to my inheritance. Kevin left his business card in case you change your mind about needing professional guidance. Lisa promised to stay available for consultation if property management becomes overwhelming. Uncle Bob simply glared and muttered something about getting legal advice from someone who wasn't involved in setting up this whole arrangement. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of family pressure disguised as concern, offers to help that were actually attempts to gain control, and increasingly desperate strategies for accessing what they now understood was substantial wealth. Kevin sent emails with detailed business plans for expanding the property portfolio, each proposal requiring his direct involvement as a managing partner. Lisa forwarded real estate listings for investment opportunities that would need her professional expertise to evaluate and acquire. Uncle Bob's approach was the most transparent and least effective. He called other family members, spreading rumors about questionable legal arrangements, and suggesting that Dad's inheritance decisions had been influenced by undue influence from people who didn't have the family's best interests at heart. His attempts to build a coalition for challenging the inheritance fell flat when distant relatives realized they had no legal standing and no evidence of any wrongdoing. The most revealing incident came 3 weeks after the revelation, when Kevin showed up at one of my properties uninvited. I was meeting with the property management company at the Grove Street duplex, reviewing some minor maintenance issues with Mrs. Rodriguez, when Kevin's BMW pulled up to the curb. He emerged wearing his most expensive suit and carrying a leather portfolio, clearly planning to insert himself into the business meeting. "Sarah," he called out, approaching with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever he decided to go. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how things are going. Mind if I sit in on the meeting? I'd love to learn more about the operational side of the business." The presumption was breathtaking. Kevin had invited himself to a private business meeting on property he didn't own, apparently expecting that his family relationship gave him access to information and operations he had no legal right to participate in. His timing wasn't coincidental either. He'd clearly been monitoring my activities, probably hoping to catch me in a situation where he could demonstrate his superior business acumen. Mrs. Rodriguez looked confused by the interruption, unsure who this overdressed stranger was, or why he thought he belonged in a conversation about her home's maintenance needs. The property manager, a professional woman named Carmen, who'd worked with Dad for years, simply waited for my guidance about how to handle the intrusion. "Kevin," I said clearly, "this is a private business meeting about property management issues. You're not involved in Martinez Holdings operations, and you don't have any role in tenant relations. You need to leave." His face flushed with embarrassment and anger as he realized his attempt to force his way into the business had been publicly rejected. "I'm just trying to understand how Dad's legacy is being managed," he said, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "As his son, I think I have a right to know how family assets are being handled." "These aren't family assets," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "This is my business, operating on my property, involving tenants who have relationships with me and my management company. You have no more right to participate in this meeting than any other stranger walking down the street." The comparison to a stranger was deliberately harsh, but it accurately reflected Kevin's legal status regarding the property business. His assumption that family relationship automatically granted him access to my operations revealed the depth of his entitlement and his inability to accept that Dad's wealth belonged entirely to me. Carmen, the property manager, stepped forward with the kind of professional diplomacy that probably came from years of handling difficult situations. "Mr. Martinez," she said to Kevin, "I understand this is a family matter, but our business relationship is exclusively with Ms. Martinez as the owner of Martinez Holdings. If you'd like information about property operations, you'll need her written authorization." The formal statement from a business professional effectively ended Kevin's attempted intrusion, but it also marked a turning point in my family relationships. Kevin's public rejection at the property site became a story that spread through our extended family network, cementing his reputation as someone who'd overplayed his hand and suffered the consequences. Lisa's reaction to Kevin's failed power play was more strategic and ultimately more dangerous. Instead of direct confrontation, she began a subtle campaign to undermine my confidence and competence as a property owner. Her approach was to offer seemingly helpful advice that was actually designed to make me doubt my ability to handle complex business decisions. "I've been researching property insurance requirements," she said during one of her increasingly frequent casual visits to my apartment. "Did you know that liability coverage needs to be updated annually based on property value assessments? There are also new regulations about lead paint disclosure and accessibility compliance that could expose you to significant legal risks if not handled properly." The information was accurate but presented in a way designed to overwhelm rather than educate. Lisa was trying to convince me that property ownership involved so many complex legal and financial requirements that I couldn't possibly manage them without professional help. Her expertise in real estate sales gave her credibility, but her advice was calculated to create anxiety rather than actual assistance. "The property management company handles all compliance issues," I told her, referring to the detailed service agreement Carmen had reviewed with me. "They monitor regulatory changes, maintain appropriate insurance coverage, and ensure all properties meet current legal requirements. Dad set up comprehensive professional management specifically, so these details would be handled by experts." Lisa's expression showed frustration that her attempt to create artificial complexity had been deflected by Dad's thorough planning. "That's good short term," she persisted, "but property management companies charge substantial fees that reduce your profits. As the portfolio grows, those costs become significant. Eventually you'll want to bring some of those functions in-house to maximize returns." The suggestion that I should eventually eliminate professional management was exactly the kind of advice Dad had warned me about in his letter. Lisa was advocating for changes that would make me more dependent on family involvement while reducing the business's professional oversight. Her recommendations sounded reasonable on the surface, but would have compromised the stable operations that made the portfolio successful. Uncle Bob's final attempt to challenge my inheritance came through his lawyer, a small-town attorney who specialized in personal injury cases and had no experience with estate law. The legal letter I received was full of vague threats about investigating irregularities and protecting family interests, but it contained no specific allegations of wrongdoing or legal violations. Margaret Chen's response was swift and devastating. Her reply, copied to me and Uncle Bob, systematically dismantled every implication in his lawyer's letter, while documenting the complete legal compliance of all inheritance procedures. Her conclusion was particularly pointed. "Mr. Robert Martinez appears to be suffering from disappointment about inheritance decisions that were made deliberately and documented thoroughly. Disappointment, however, is not grounds for legal challenge, and continued harassment of the legal beneficiary could result in restraining order proceedings. The threat of legal action against Uncle Bob effectively ended his attempts to challenge the inheritance through formal channels, but it also marked the final breakdown of any pretense of family unity. He stopped calling, stopped visiting, and began telling anyone who would listen that Dad's wealth had corrupted Sarah and destroyed the family. The irony was perfect. Uncle Bob was claiming that inheriting Dad's wealth had changed me, when the truth was that learning about the wealth had simply revealed who everyone had been all along. I hadn't become greedy or power-hungry or dismissive of family relationships. I'd simply stopped accepting condescension and manipulation from people who'd never respected me in the first place. 6 months after the revelation, I was walking through the commercial building Dad owned downtown, reviewing renovation plans with Carmen and a contractor. The barber shop was expanding into the adjacent space, the restaurant was updating its kitchen equipment, and the tax preparation service was adding staff to handle growing demand. These weren't just tenants paying rent, they were small business owners building their dreams in spaces Dad had provided and maintained. Standing in that building surrounded by the evidence of what Dad had built and what I was continuing to grow, I finally understood the full scope of his gift to me. The money was significant, but it wasn't the real inheritance. The properties were valuable, but they weren't the true legacy. What Dad had really left me was the freedom to choose my own relationships, the security to reject manipulation, and the confidence to trust my own judgment about who deserved my time and energy. My family calls occasionally now, usually around holidays, or when they need something they think my wealth might provide. Kevin's business hit some rough patches, and he's hinted that a family loan might help him through temporary difficulties. Lisa's real estate career has plateaued, and she's suggested that joint ventures between her expertise and my capital could benefit everyone involved. Uncle Bob doesn't call at all, but I hear through other relatives that he's still telling anyone who'll listen about the suspicious circumstances surrounding Dad's inheritance decisions. I don't miss the relationships we used to have, probably because they were never real relationships to begin with. They were based on their assumptions about my limitations and their confidence in their own superiority. When those assumptions proved false, there was nothing left to sustain the connections we'd maintained for years. Instead, I've built new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Mrs. Rodriguez invites me for dinner occasionally, sharing stories about her grandchildren and asking for advice about the garden we now maintain together. The Johnson family sends holiday cards with pictures of their kids playing in the courtyard Dad designed for them. Carmen has become not just a business partner but a friend who understands the responsibility that comes with providing homes for people who depend on stable, affordable housing. These relationships exist because of who I am, rather than what I own, though my ownership makes it possible to maintain the quality housing that brings us together. The wealth Dad left me isn't just financial security. It's the foundation for building the kind of community he believed in, where business success serves human flourishing, rather than extracting profit from human need. Last week I visited Dad's grave for the first time since the lawyer's office revelation. The headstone looked the same, simple granite with his name and dates, nothing indicating the empire he'd built or the transformation he'd orchestrated. But standing there I could finally thank him properly for what he'd given me. Not just the money, though that changed everything. Not just the properties, though they provide security I'd never imagined possible. What Dad really gave me was the knowledge that I was worth his careful planning, his patient accumulation of wealth, and his deliberate choice to entrust his life's work to my judgment. He saw qualities in me that my family had never recognized, and he built a legacy that would allow those qualities to flourish. The girl who got the scraps had become the woman who inherited the kingdom, exactly as Dad had planned. But more importantly, she'd learned that kingdoms built on genuine care and sustained by fair dealing were worth more than all the empires her family might have constructed through optimization and leverage and maximum profit extraction. Walking back to Dad's old truck, which I still drove out of choice rather than necessity, I thought about his final lesson. True wealth wasn't about accumulating the most money, or owning the most properties, or impressing people with visible success. True wealth was about creating value that outlasted your own life, building relationships that enriched everyone involved, and choosing people who deserved your trust over people who demanded it. Dad had spent 25 years building more than a real estate empire. He'd built a test that revealed everyone's character while ensuring that the person who passed the test would have the resources to act on their principles rather than just dream about them. The inheritance wasn't just his gift to me. It was his gift to every tenant who would continue living in well-maintained, affordable housing. Every small business owner who would build their dreams in his commercial spaces, and every person who would benefit from wealth being managed by someone who understood that real success serves something larger than itself. I drove home through neighborhoods where Dad's properties provided stable housing for working families, past the commercial building where small businesses thrived, in spaces he'd carefully maintained, through the community he'd helped build one relationship at a time. This was his true legacy, not the bank accounts or property deeds, but the ongoing creation of value that would continue long after both of us were gone. And somehow that felt like the most valuable inheritance of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.